Test, test, test. 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Test 1 2. Test, test, 1, 2. 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Test, 1, 2. 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Earpiece check, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Earpiece test, 1, 2. 1, 2. Testing. Earpiece 1, 2.
Is that on?
Yes, sir.
Give me a test real quick.
Hello?
Yeah, all right.
Test, test, 1, 2. Test, test, 1, 2.
Give me a test real quick.
Hello, hello, hello.
Okay.
Testing. You guys here in the back?
Test, test, 1 2 1 2. Test 1 2. Check, check. One, two. Test.
We're going to start in a couple of minutes, so if those of you still getting lunch could get through the lunch line and be seated, we'll be ready to go. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning and this afternoon. My name is Rick Ponton. I am one of the co-chairs of the Austin Advisory Group of NACD, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for a great topic that can never get enough attention, and that's forming a board of directors for a startup or an emerging company. We've got a great panel. I'm going to be doing some introductions there in a second, but first of all, I'd just like to thank our program sponsors, Alvarez & Marshall, Deanery, RGP, and NACD for their efforts to bring this program here to you today. I think you'll see as we go through this that it will enlighten you, educate you, inform you, and make you better prepared as you navigate the startup world and how you can implement programs that improve good governance, good decision-making, good strategy, good personnel decisions. Before we go ahead and get started, just a couple of words about NACD and some of our programs. We think it's always important to give our members and our guests a viewpoint of what NACD is, what it stands for, and what benefits you derive by being part of it. You know, we just went over the 20,000 member mark, which is an outstanding accomplishment. 87% of the Fortune 1000 boards are members of NACD, and we've got a number of directors that join every single week, so over 300 a month are actually joining to become part of this organization. And the reason they're joining, you know, we come here and we benefit by these programs, but NACD offers so much more than these programs. A lot of research and a lot of analytics on the website on a number of topics. And I will tell you, over the last 3 or 4 years, the topics around emerging boards and emerging companies has really increased in terms of the focus of what our national organization is doing. Every day we get an NACD brief in terms of what's happening around the country with governance and issues. I find that to be outstanding, and I'm sure many of you do as well. There's the e-magazine. There's references to how NACD can actually help you recruit board members and how each of you could be resources for NACD to be part of that. And of course, we have our programs here, our breakfast programs, our lunch programs. We sometimes have evening programs. One of the things we're going to kick back up this year is peer-to-peer networking, small dinners, small lunches for a small number of people where you can really get intimate on a subject. And there's tons of webinars and there's tons of national events that you can take part of, including one that's going to be here locally called the Emerging Corporate Board Forum. This is a brand new program. It is for companies that are in the startup and the emerging phase. We asked for it to be here in Austin because we believe that this is the hotbed for what you're going to learn about today and participate in and give us feedback on. That's in October. It's an outstanding program, and you know, it's just one more step that NACD at a national level is taking in order to up our game for the emerging and startup company, which is very important to us here in Austin. Around our chapter, the Tri-Cities chapters has locations here in Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. And we have a number of programs. We obviously have this program here today. We've got a couple of great programs that are going to be happening in September, in October, you know, around adding diversity to your board, about protecting data, which is important no matter what size company you are. So we think we've got some great programs here. If you're in the Houston area or San Antonio area, we have a number of programs there as well that are just as compelling and just as interesting. So hope you'll take up as part of your membership all those programs and all that comes with it. Okay, now let's get to the program. First of all, before I introduce Rick, there are cards on your table. If you have any question at any point in time that you'd like to ask, please use the cards, write your question on the cards, and Becky and Jen and others will be around to pick those cards up. So please do that. Please don't hesitate. The Q&A is the most important part of the presentation. So let me introduce Rick Timmons to you. Rick, I've known Rick now, I think, for, I guess, about 4 years. I first met him as part of my role here in NACD. You know, I've really gotten to know what kind of a man he is and what kind of a person he is and what kind of a leader and how he thinks about startups and entrepreneurial companies. But he didn't start in this world. He started in the big companies. He started at Motorola. You know, he worked his way up the finance chain. He then went to Cisco, spent a number of years there. And then I guess he finally decided to go to the bright side as opposed to the dark side, and that was the entrepreneurial world. Is that pretty much it right there? Yeah. So, you know, he has served as a past chairman of the Central Texas Angels Network. He's now a member of the board of directors of the National Angel Capital Association. As part of his experiences, he's invested in almost 20 companies and provides governance and leadership and advice and counsel. And he's been nice enough and kind enough to be able to put this program together for us. He's a Austin resident for quite a long time, and one of our cherished resources here in town. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rick, and come on up to the stage, and we'll go from there. Thank you. Let's give him a nice round of applause.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Rick. So the number of companies I've invested in is a little off.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, I've made 49 investments in companies. So I am looking to write the check number 50 company. It may be in this room, I don't know. Before I get started, thanks for y'all coming here. I've made a couple presentations. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me in the back? All right. All right, so I've made a couple presentations in this room previously, and none of the people in the audience here today have previously been in some of those sessions, because in my wallet here, I have a $100 bill, and I was ready to provide it to anyone who sat on one of the whoopee cushions over there.
Rick?
We'll talk later. So, he did it. He earned it. All right. It's good to be here. We're going to talk about startup boards, but I'm going to have a group of individuals that's also going to help me do this. Mitch Jacobson is currently the executive director of the Austin Technology Incubator, or ATI, very, very influential group here in town. His perspectives will be very, very helpful. Charlie Plotch is a partner at S3 Ventures, a very, very active venture firm here in Austin on fund number 3? Six. See how much I know. Fund 6. Here in Austin, and as I said, a very, very active venture group. And then finally, we're going to have Chris Ripley. Chris has started over and been involved with 10 startup companies, and he's only 26. He's older than that. But he's been involved in many, many startup companies, currently the CEO of Smarter Sorting. His perspectives will probably be the most helpful, because he's been there, done that. And when we come up for the panel discussions and Q&A, I think his insights will be very, very valuable. Okay, so let's get started. So that's what I'm going to go through. We're actually going to quiz you. You will have a test. We will start that off in a moment here, but then I'll go through this material. It'll take about 25 minutes to go through this. Hold off on your questions. I think they have these Q&A sheets or cards or something that they have. Is that right, Jen? Cards that they can fill out to ask questions. We'll collect them, and when we get up with the panel, you'll have the opportunity to submit those questions and hear what the panelists have to say. Okay, so here is the quiz. Question number 1. If you don't raise your hand, by the way, we have video that will be played back, and bad things will happen to you, so raise your hands. Okay, so you're forming your first board, very first board. You're a startup company, right? You're growing, and now you have to form what's called a board. They just learned how to spell that, many entrepreneurs. How many members should you have? 2, 3, 4, or 5? Show of hands. How many say 2? 2 members on the board. How many say 3? A lot of hands going up. How many say 4? 1. How many say 5? Smaller number, but 3 seem to be what carried today. I'm not going to tell you the answer. It'll be in the presentation, I think, during the course of today. And by the way, thank you. I think everyone raised their hand there. Okay, here we go. Board timing. A little harder. You're forming your first board, the most logical time to do it. A, completion of friends and family round, 250K, friends and family. B, completion of a convertible debt round of about 500K with some outside investors. C, completion of a preferred equity round of $1 million with angel investors. Or D, at a later stage. Show of hands. How many say A? Friends and family round. Quite a bit. Okay. How many say B? Convertible debt, 500K. A lot of hands. That may carry it. We'll see. C, preferred equity, $1 million. Okay, that's in the minority so far. B's carrying it. D, later stage. Hand goes up for that. Okay. This answer is in the presentation. Finally, last question. You're the CEO of vegan-based consumer packaged goods company and are making the decision on who to place on the board. You should select a knowledgeable and involved family member / investor. Dad, maybe. B, seed stage investor and former entrepreneur in a SaaS-based software company. Or C, a famous person, well known in the vegan consumer space. Show of hands. How many say A? Oh, a couple hands go up. Okay. B, seed stage investor, former SaaS base. A lot of hands are going up for that one. Okay. C, famous person, well known. Okay. B seemed to carry the day on that one. That also will be in the presentation today and get your answers. I can see in the audience today, very few got 3 out of 3. Very few. All right, let's go through it. Okay, so when to form a board. So you can perform it at any time, before or after this thing of FF&F. FF&F, friends, family, and fools. Yeah, that funding round. Friends and family often tell you what you want to hear as opposed to what you need to hear. They're family, right? Most successful boards that I have seen are formed after outside equity is raised, usually from angel investors, seed investors, outside parties, outside individuals in the equity round. And what happens is when this equity is put into the company from these outside members or outside angels, 95 times out of 100, they're going to require an entrepreneur to form a board. For the first time in his or her career, these entrepreneurs are going to be required to do this and to provide the appropriate governance, communication, and learning that needs to come from a competent and capable board. And whether it's a C Corp or an LLC, doesn't make a difference on the entity structure. It will be required, and in the documents, the term sheets, and in the documents that get completed, that these boards will have to be formed at that stage. And it's usually a stage that requires an investment, could be as little as $250,000. Oftentimes it's more, but at that level of funding, boards are formed. And there's some data at the bottom of the page. Most boards are not formed when debt is raised, convertible notes typically. Only 4% of the time do they form at that stage, but 3 out of 4 times they are formed when equity is put into the company. So, and today, here in Austin, I venture to guess probably 50-50 in terms of when investments are first made by outside organizations into a startup company. 50% of them are equity, 50% of them are convertible debt. But in almost all cases, when equity is placed into a company, they are forming a board. And so when I give this presentation to entrepreneurs, which I have done now a few times, I tell them that they have to be prepared and willing to do this because it is a requirement for equity funding. So there's actually legal and committed information contained in a term sheet that we ask a entrepreneur to sign, and we will ask them to form the board specifically with the kind of membership that is going to be appropriate and helpful to them. And that's either in the 3 to 5 range, 3 members or 5 members. Typically, the great majority of time when they're forming their first board, it's 3 members. And I will show you what the makeup of a board is typically when a entrepreneur first forms his or her board. And in all cases, not 90%, not 95%, and 100% of the time, it will also be written that they will have to have D&O insurance. We're all familiar with that kind of coverage at public and large private company boards. It also is required at this stage too. So there is, and we have, for instance, in CTAN, we have a list of groups or organizations we work with that the entrepreneur can utilize to contact for writing D&O coverage for these boards. It's required and it's important. Okay, so continuing on with some of the legal aspects of these boards, there is a lot of documents that are prepared when funding is originally completed. So we obviously, if you're a C Corp, the articles of incorporation, bylaws, shareholder agreements are done, board of director agreements that actually lay out the responsibilities and how this board is going to be formed, many other documents. So when a entrepreneur receives funding, typically from an angel group or angel investors, they are put in touch with attorneys that we even have a list of that they can utilize if they don't have their own legal representation, and it'll cost them anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 in fees, legal fees that they'll have to incur. Oftentimes, by the way, we make the entrepreneur pay for our fees too, so that's double sometimes. But they have to incur these costs to form their boards. It's very important that they do this and they do it correctly and they understand how to do this. And good counsel and good attorneys can help them understand that too. So, board composition, board size. The mythology of creating boards with odd numbers carries into this realm of forming boards also, so that it's either going to be 3 or 5. Typically, it's 3. Probably 80% of the time it's 3. Sometimes it's 5. But at this very, very early stage, first board, it's 3. Although I'm seeing more and more public company boards with even numbers, but that's another whole story. I think Apple and Facebook, I think, have even numbers on their boards. But anyway, it carries over here. 3 is typical. And what happens is these boards get formed in a way that requires the approval of the preferred shareholders. Typically, the equity investments that are made at this level are preferred shares. And these preferred shareholders, subject to CEO or entrepreneur approval, are nominated by the preferred shareholders and vetted by the CEO, such that one of the investors who's been interested and involved in this company will join that board for the first time, is the typical composition of an outside person. Oftentimes, if there's a co-founder with the company, he or she will also be on the board, or another inside person into the company, one of the very, very senior people in these companies that are generally very small, much oftentimes less than 10 people. But 1 or 2 of those inside people, I'll call them, coupled with the outside preferred shareholder, subject to approval of the CEO, is placed on the board, and that then will compose the 3-person board. And so it's a balance between inside and outside people. The votes that happen when you do vote on topics, and I'll show you what some of those topics are in a moment, they're very much unanimous. or near unanimous every time, just like you do in public company boards. But there is a notion that these independent directors and the inside people are representing all the shareholders, okay? And I'll talk about that again further on in the pitch here. So here is that. So we have to educate entrepreneurs oftentimes about these responsibilities of boards. It's not just, quote, an inside job kind of activity for these people. There's governance, there's fiduciary requirements. And you can see the list of things now that these boards are typically required to do because it's written in the documents that I shared with you earlier. And there is the duty of care at this level and the duty of loyalty so that they are representing all shareholders and that there's no conflicts of interest. And then the last item on the chart here, at this stage, and even the next stage that I'll share with you in a little bit, there's no subcommittees here. There's no audit committee. There's no compensation committee. There's no governance committee. We got 3 people on this board. Come on. We don't need that at this point. And I've served on, in fact, I still serve on public company boards. So it's very different. And these are really, really important. So I stress this to entrepreneurs when I give this presentation to them, is begin to think about, just as important that we shared with you, the formal responsibilities of what a board needs to do and how it needs to work. There's a lot of informal activities that I think, frankly, are a little more important. Recruiting, helping to grow sales, being able to speak to potential customers, being able to speak to employees, help with recruiting. And so you want your preferred shareholder or independent board member to think and be able to be utilized in a strategic manner. And so when you join these boards, it's oftentimes these activities that, to me, are more important and, if done proactively and effectively, will result in a good CEO and a well-run company. And again, I feel that these responsibilities, as I've served on I've served on 8 private company boards, I serve on 1 now. I feel these tasks are more important. What I do informally with the CEO is just as important, if not more important, than the formal responsibilities I shared 2 slides ago. Sorry about that. Okay, so there's this notion of, and we come across this a lot in startup companies, advisory boards. And I've given some negative comments here that you can see on the slides with respect to advisory boards. But at the end of the day, if you run advisory boards properly and appropriately, they can help. But I find oftentimes, in more cases than not, entrepreneurs don't use advisory boards well, and they almost put them up for show as opposed to making them effective. So you can use advisory boards, particularly in life science companies, medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies. These kinds of individuals, subject matter experts I call them, will do a good job for you and can help, but you have to use them effectively. And by the way, you have to compensate these people. So well-run advisory boards who provide good advice and insights, you have to give them some equity, anywhere from 0.25% to 1%. Okay, so let's talk about that in terms of board compensation. So serving on a startup board is not going to make you or me rich. Hasn't for me so far. But so I go to a board and I will serve on these boards for equity, not much, anywhere from 0.25% to 0.5%, 1% equity, called stock options, that will vest over 2 to 4 years. We're going to talk to Charlie here on venture capital. They never even get any of the equity. They don't need it. They don't want it. They've already taken a large chunk of the company. We'll talk about that, Charlie. So, but you should cover their out-of-pocket expenses if they got to travel and or incur costs. And these board terms are generally 3 to 4 years. So we're there to help these companies. We're not there to find this as a money position. So and again, when I speak to entrepreneurs about this, this is an important slide I oftentimes emphasize with entrepreneurs, is how to select board members. This is not a trivial task, and it needs to be thought of very strategically and very importantly, because it's hard to fire board members. You want to pick the right one. The preferred shareholders will help nominate their person, but you as the CEO or entrepreneur want to make sure that there's going to be a good connection with this individual. So meeting with the board, potential board member in an informal environment, getting to know this person is a very, very important task. You want to pick the right person, and you want to pick a person who is going to help, not just as I said in those formal environments called board meetings, but you want them to help and be around when you need them. So I really emphasize to entrepreneurs and CEOs to take the time to do this right. This is almost the equivalent of hiring a co-founder or a VP of sales and or CTO kind of person. To me, it's critical that you hire the right person, or one that's been nominated by the preferred shareholders is the right fit, both formally and informally for you. And if it's not, be courageous enough to say, no, let's think about someone else. So, pitfalls to avoid: not taking the board selection process seriously, as opposed to, okay, I got to do this, let's get on with it. So really thinking about how you can use a board and a board member to advance what you need to advance in terms of your, not just strategy, but a lot of activity with potential customers, with individuals around hiring or employees, and take the time to really research this person almost as much as you would research a new hire. And really have a good understanding with this potential board member around the expectations. Clearly call that out in discussions with this board member, because this is really, really a very important person who's going to help you if done properly. Okay, in terms of once you're on the board, I tell the board CEO, the entrepreneur, these meetings now, in fact, oftentimes they're even spelled out in term sheets, but these meetings are much more frequent than the typical quarterly public board meetings. These are every 6 weeks, every month, sometimes 8 weeks. They will have the potential to move them quarterly, but I've served on boards through venture capital staged B rounds and C rounds, and even at that stage, we were meeting every other month, 6 times a year. So they just need more advice and help, and good CEOs like that, and they'll have those meetings 6, 7 times a year. Meetings are typically 3 hours, could move longer. And good CEOs will reach out informally to their board members. I'm having coffee with with the CEO next week on a topic that came up in the board meeting, and we'll meet for a couple hours to talk about it. Okay, so when you're on a public company board, this happens, right? They've grown up, they've learned how to do this, and that's why they're public company boards. When you're at an entrepreneurial startup company, you mean I have to have the materials ahead of time? I can't just bring it to the meeting? Yeah, you got to have it ahead of time. I want to be able to look at it too. I'm the board member. Can you have it a couple days before we have the meeting? Maybe 1 day at least. Night before would be okay too. So we want our CEOs and entrepreneurs to be prepared and to have the outside board member also appropriately prepared. We don't have these things called executive sessions. I know we have them in public board companies at the end of a meeting where we have excused the CEO and internal organization people and have an executive session. Nothing like that happens at this stage. Even with B round and C round funding, that just doesn't happen. These board meetings will typically, as I said, last 2, 3, 4 hours and be frequent. Okay, so I tell entrepreneurs, please don't give me a surprise. I don't want to come to this board meeting and hear for the first time our CTO is resigning. Please. So don't give me surprises. And in the meetings, you have to be frank, you have to be honest. So I want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want to hear what's going on that's well, what's going on that's not well, and what's going on that we can collectively decide on to improve upon. Okay? So last couple slides here. This is something that happens not too often, at least item number 2. Item 1 is pretty good. I see a lot of good CEOs do this, where they become accountable in our board meetings. I actually take minutes. We take action items, and we report back out on them. Kind of a basic thing. But if we're going to decide all these things and on a course of action and move forward at these board meetings, let's decide what it is we're going to do and how we're going to be doing it and when we're going to be doing it and get it out so everyone knows. And then more importantly, this is a topic number 2 that I can give a whole different talk on, is how boards at this stage prepare for something called an exit. We don't do that very often. And I'm not talking about an exit that's going to give an IPO. That happens so infinitesimally, did I say that right? Small. We want to work on potential exits where a strategic acquirer could maybe acquire us for $50 million. And with cap tables and the way they're put together, a $50 million exit at an early stage with an entrepreneur keeping 60% of the company and the employees, that's life-changing money. We can do that. But we have to work on it. Takes time, takes effort, takes 2 or 3 years. So 12, 18 months into a board formation, we're going to start to talk about this. Just like identifying potential customers, let's think about how we can identify potential acquirers and what is a roadmap for that. I think that's an important topic that oftentimes is not discussed, that should be discussed. Okay, so last slide, I think. These are outside resources. All of them are good. NACD resources are good. The first 2 are really good on those additional resources. That Kaufman Fellows website is very good. And then Brad Feld, many of you know Brad Feld is one of the co-founders of Techstars and a very, very good entrepreneur and CEO himself. He's written a book about this, and you can read his book on boards. I get a lot of my ideas from Brad. I met him too, he's a good guy. Okay, I'll skip that for now. Okay, that's it. Thanks for joining, and now let's bring the panel up for Q&A. So I think there may have been some questions already been circulated. And now these guys get to get on the firing line, and I get to...
Should we start with all the things we disagreed with about your
Yeah,
presentation?
that could be a good idea.
Yeah, I'd love it if I've never gotten dismissed during the board meeting for the other folks to talk about me.
That's a good. Before we
Yeah.
have questions, let's hear some of you guys' thoughts about what I said. And
I actually think I got all 3.
oh, you did?
Yeah. It was a great presentation. The only thing I would comment on is around the executive sessions and board meetings. So
Oh, okay.
Rick and I serve on one board together, but in a lot of my company's Series A, B, C stages, I do try to
Okay.
install that practice. I
Good.
think it's really good because if there's something that, the board's not together often, so when you're in the board meeting, it's good to set that up as a practice, even if there's nothing to really talk about.
Yep.
So a lot of times we'll exit the CEO and then maybe there's something to talk about, maybe there's not, but we'll talk for a while, and it's really a great thing. You bring the CEO back in, or you can do it one-on-one afterward and kind of give them feedback on what went good or what did not go so good in the board meeting. But I think that's a healthy way to do it. But other than that, you covered everything very nicely.
Yeah, I truly enjoyed the presentation. There's 2, so I've been on the side of being a Series A company with a post money of 12 million, and a lot of what we're talking about, in terms of the keeping it small, all made a lot of sense. No subcommittees, et cetera. Now with a much larger Series A company, burning much more cash per month. We're burning about 800 grand a month, so we end up with a little bit more governance and a little bit more subcommittees and just a little bit
Okay.
more of a unwieldy board sometimes, but I think it's a realistic requirement given the amount of capital, I think.
Okay.
And the thing that I would add in the advisory board section is, because at the Austin Technology Incubator, we are dealing with pretty early stage companies who normally don't have a board of directors when they get to us. And one of the first things we try to do is to help form an advisory board. So your point about the fact that they don't work is
Yeah.
disappointing. We put a lot of emphasis into not only making sure they work, but also, through our contacts, potentially getting people on the boards. Your instincts are right in terms of life sciences, because it's very specific, but in some other areas as well. I mean, Chris's company, Smarter Sorting, was an ATI company. They graduated. But it is an area, this whole waste circular economy area is fairly newish in terms of technology around it. And there are some experts in that field that that he could or should get on his advisory board first before, now he's way past that at this point, but the advisory board could be incredibly important, especially when you're pitching for money, because that's when your potential investors see that on their pitch and say, oh yeah, it makes it more gives the company more value and validation.
I will say that the advisory, oftentimes, not often, not always, but the advisory boards that I have vetted when I do the due diligence on companies that at the angel investing stage we're looking at are oftentimes show boards as opposed to real advisory boards for advice. So it has a flavor sometimes that you can see through when you do the appropriate due diligence, but to your point, if they are put together well and effectively, they can be very, very helpful.
I think the issue is that as a young CEO, you don't really know that you can ask so much of your board members. Right. And so I remember my first advisory boards, they were show boards, and they were a complete waste of equity. And I imagine it wasn't even that rewarding, even for the board members that made a little money off of a deal, to be on the boards, because I wasn't using them effectively. And so that part about that you presented, just about the regular board and how that commitment, if you're using your advisory board and they're committed and you're communicating with them and you're having some regular meetings with some structure, that makes sense. But I think that most of my advisory shares have sort of been wasted bilaterally. I've wasted my shares and they've wasted a lot of their time because it hasn't been structured as much. Now when we got to ATI, they really taught us how to use an advisory board, and we got better at it, but we sort of needed to know that was the right thing to do.
But I'm curious about your opinion. When you see a company that's coming out of an incubator or something, they've already raised a seed round, going out for a Series A at this point, what's your, and they may or may not have a board of directors based on the funding, what do you look at for an advisory board?
Yeah, so I would agree with Rick that they're usually not providing much value because they're not managed well. Typically, I don't put a lot of weight when early stage companies throw up, oh, all these people on my advisory board. So like, hey, you want to be on our advisory board? Hey, here's a grant. Like, they don't do anything. Where I've seen it work well, and have seen it work really well a few times, is when there's some type of structure where you're meeting, even if it's just annually or semi-annually. You have all these people in the same room, you're doing a strategy session or something to that effect, and so you're actually getting them engaged. Other than that, they sign up a famous advisor or well-known person in the industry, and then they never talk to them and they never meet with them, and they don't get much out of it. So I don't put a ton of weight in it. I mean, it's good if they're interested. It's not a negative, so I would say it's a positive. We just don't put a lot of weight in it. But I've seen one company in particular does a client advisory board where they have their largest clients. They form this board, and they meet with them 2 times a year, and they come in and we get all this. The whole board will come to the client advisory board meeting. We do it before one of our board meetings, and you just will learn tons of stuff about the industry, and you'll get feedback on the product and stuff. So
having Matthew McConaughey or Andy Roddick on the board doesn't do a whole lot.
No, not a whole lot. I get you a little extra press on the funding or something.
Here's a couple, a lot of questions that we've seen come in, and here's the first one. Of the top 2 or 3 things boards should not do.
Come to meetings unprepared.
So there's a work component and a plan ahead and understand ahead what's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking earlier about materials coming out, a day or 2 in advance. We try to get them 48 hours in advance at least. Most entrepreneurs not meet that deadline, so I'm often on a plane ride to some board meeting and reading the materials. But But still, even if you're up late the night before the meeting trying to get the materials done, if you're at the meeting and you haven't gone through the materials, then you're going to be unprepared
Right.
and not really, have some good thoughts or comments. So that's kind of the number one thing, but talking too much is another.
I was actually just going to say that. I think just the other way, which is not involvement to too involved. There is I've got, and this probably isn't in the venture capital stage. It could be, I guess, but from a seed stage, if you actually do form a board at 250,000 or 500,000, and you've got the 3 or 5 folks on that board, and this is personal money, this is angel money, and this is, I think most folks that are investing, it's from CTAN or SWAN or some of these other groups are professional enough not to do this, but I think getting involved with their business on a daily basis could be, these guys are busy. Building a startup business is hard. It takes a lot of time. They're working this 24/7. If you're getting a call from one of your advisors or your board of directors 3 times a day, that's not good either.
That's a good point. I've seen that happen, and that is not a good situation when the board member gets too involved in the business.
Board members should not be opining on product roadmap details.
Right.
Like, high level, yes, but.
Yeah. All right, when an outside independent board member is brought on, what skill sets are you typically looking for?
We start off with a mirror test, and so they fog the mirror. That's excellent. I've done this extremely poorly, so I'm learning more about how to select the right independent. But what we were looking for is to fill truly diverse slots in our company. So we had a couple people that had done startup. We have some finance folks. We wanted to find some people that had some later stage experience, as an example, and then fill in some industry specific. I don't know how to stop that, sorry. Industry specific was also something we were looking for.
Is that you making all that noise?
I guess, I don't know.
We'll see.
Here's an interesting question. I've had some experience with this, and I can give a thought around it too, but I'd like to hear from you guys. What do you recommend for directors of a company in crisis, i.e. bankruptcy, or directors who believe the company is being mismanaged?
What do you recommend directors do in the situation of
Yes.
crisis?
Yeah.
Do your best to save whatever you can. I was just chatting with Rick before this. Unfortunately, the ones that get in trouble, and I've been on the board of a couple of companies that didn't work out, and several that have worked out very nicely, and the ones that tend to work out and do better tend to take less time than the ones that get into trouble, and they have bank debt, and their liquidity is less than the amount of debt they owe, and they become in a liquidity crunch, and there's certain responsibilities you have as a board member to notify the bank and start trying to do what you can to get the bank repaid at some level. I've seen that happen before, but you got to roll your sleeves up and get hands-on to try to get whatever outcome you can. If it's in that kind of crisis, I guess there's other crises too, but.
Yeah, I would say, managing crisis as a whole, there's lots of books out there about managing crisis. It is just like anything else, crisis in your life, crisis in your business. You got to, be somewhat calm about it, because crisis management can get really out of hand at a company, especially a small company. It could fall apart like that. Employees could start running, and you could be bankrupt pretty quick. Whereas maybe you could save it if you're just totally crazy about it, or your board's totally crazy about it. I think it can go down. The ship could go down faster than maybe needed.
I've had some very experienced public board members on my boards that felt like we were in a crisis as it can't be, right?
I swear I'm not doing it.
You can't be me. I don't, it's your fault.
Just happens
So,
when you talk. I don't know.
publicly traded board members that felt like we were in crisis because we were growing so fast. So when you have 0 revenue and your first contract's going to be $12 million at 80% margin, and you are growing from 10 people, and then you're going to hire 30 people the next quarter. I've had that feel a lot like crisis when the director was sort of used to sort of a smoother sailing ship, And I think a lot of startups just aren't smooth sailing ships as they're growing. And so I know that that's not the crisis question that you're asking, but it's interesting how sometimes the emotions are similarly mirror each other depending on the experience of the board member.
I was actually put on a board that received $5.5 million of outside angel funding, no venture capital funding, so a significant amount of funding, and the company was mismanaged by the CEO on a 3-member inside board. And I was put on that board specifically and solely to fire the CEO. And that was a very, very big challenge that literally had an attorney for the company there in the meeting, an attorney for the preferred shareholders in the meeting, and an attorney representing literally the individual CEO in the meeting. So it was operating in crisis and a lot of issues for 3 months. We eventually did it, but it took a lot of work to, in effect, replace that CEO who did not want to be replaced. Did not want to be replaced.
So therefore, you were dealing with lawsuits or potential
Yes,
lawsuits and things
potential lawsuits, getting ready to actually serve papers unless he would step aside. Not fun. Here's another question. Ways to handle toxic board members, especially institutional investors with strong adversarial, strategic, and technical skills. Charlie, what do you say?
We'll see if this microphone works. How do you handle a toxic board member that's invested $10 million in your company?
Yes.
You deal with them. I mean, any institutional VC that comes in, right, like as you talked about earlier, is going to be able to designate a seat. And I don't know of situations where seats get changed outside of somebody leaving a firm or something. So, but ideally, you've spent a lot of time getting to know that investor before they invest. You've talked to other founders that serve on boards with them, and that's one of the things I do before I'm closing around. I give, the founder the email and cell phone numbers of all the other founders and CEOs I work with, and say, call them up, talk to them, and if you don't have a VC that's not willing to do that, well, that should be a red flag. But there's not a lot you can do to you can't just kick off the preferred directors.
Is there ever a situation where, whether it's the member of the venture capital company that's the board member, or the member of the institutional money that's in, changes people from within the same firm? Because in some cases it's because of knowledge or contacts or other things, but just in terms of the fact that that person is not getting along with the rest of the people on the board.
I haven't seen it where they're not getting along. I've seen it where somebody leaves a firm to do something else and they get squished. I saw another example where there was basically an outside Texas firm that had invested in small scopes, and they had 2 partners traveling from Florida to Austin, and then it ended up where one of the partners ended up having like 2 or 3 investments here, and then this other partner just had 1, and so they switched it literally for travel and geography reasons, I think. But I haven't seen one where it's going so badly with the partner of the firm that some other partner says, "Oh, well, I'll take it." Yeah, like that's usually not gonna happen.
Yeah, there's no divorces from your preferred, so you've got to gut it out and be willing to. I think those communications, when there starts to be stress with a board member, I just turn up the amount of calls per month, and that's been my solution. And it sometimes it's really tough those first few calls, but essentially just by just being good people and having more time, you end up getting through it. But since there's no divorces, that's your only choice.
Yeah, and I would just say that it is a marriage once you take investment from a venture capital firm, and if there's a toxic, quote unquote toxic relationship between the CEO and the investors, that's likely not going to end well for the CEO. That a lot of people think, that there's all these adversarial relationships and boards, and there's these big debates, and it's negative, and it's the opposite is true, right? Like our founders and CEOs are frankly friends of mine. Like we're talking to them all the time. It's a very positive relationship. You almost never see anything come down to a vote. We do have odd-membered boards. That's a practice of ours for obvious reasons, but I've only seen things like actually come to a board vote that was not unanimous, like 1 or 2 times out of thousands of board meetings, and so. it's typically a very positive relationship. Even if things are not going great with the company, it can still be positive. Toxic is not a good thing.
All right. How should early stage boards go about achieving diversity?
That's a great question, and we focus on that quite a bit because I would think that's a hot topic everywhere we go. Unfortunately, we have 4 white men up here, which is not a good thing. And I'm very conscientious of that because we do a lot of this kind of stuff. So we really put a lot of effort into placing a woman or person of color in these kinds of situations, which is not that much different than a board, other than the fact that board members have to have some kind of skill set or investment or what have you to go for it. I think it takes a lot of effort to do that, especially in Austin, Texas, where we're a fairly white community. And but I think it's worth it in the end because that's the world we live, it's the world we should be living in forever, but it surely is the world we live in today.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that's top of mind, and I think that there's obvious value in having diversity within your board and your executive team. We are often trying to get female independent board members. We have several within our portfolio, and female in particular, kind of having that gender diversity, I think is really important. I'm the son of a female entrepreneur, and she was the breadwinner for most of my life, so I'm all about backing some female entrepreneurs. We have several in the portfolio, and looking for some independent board members right now.
Yeah, our next independent we will heavily be biased towards bringing on more diversity.
Okay, good. Is there value to an outside directors for a very closely held, self-funded company? No outside investors, capital. Is there value to these boards?
Absolutely, I've experienced that before, where I had an exit, funded my next company. It was actually the first company that I had a board for. You need advice from someone. You need a sounding board from someone. You could pay your lawyer. You could pay a consultant, or you could act like a grown-up company and have a board. It's a little bit different. It seems because the director CEO relationship seems to be a little askew when the most of the preferred shares is in the hands of the CEO. But yeah, I totally think that's a good thing.
I would say, because we do a lot of this, I mean, I sit on a lot of our boards as they are growing up. The biggest thing about a board in that situation is contacts. You know, the more, and that's one of the reasons why mentorship goes on with early stage companies. You go up to Capital Factory, you'll find, all day there's folks like you up on the 16th floor and the 5th floor mentoring early stage companies who might ask you to be on their advisory board or potentially actually form a board of directors, even though there's not outside money coming in, because your connections are extremely important to them. And their connections, and that's why LinkedIn works so well, right? Because it's this connectivity. And the more people that could help that company, whether they're mentors or potentially invitations to or initiations to strategic partners and customers and things, that goes a long way.
Okay. Here's a person maybe challenging one of my thoughts in the presentation, as hard as it is to believe that. What is the reasoning for not gathering or not getting a board member who is famous in his or her domain, as opposed to another type of person?
Well, famous in terms of, if they're in that industry, fine. If it's just Matthew McConaughey because, sorry Matthew, I didn't mean to pick on you here, but just because he's famous, not sure that. So my son-in-law has a CPG company, and there's a famous actor who now drinks his drink, and so that could do a lot for his exposure in the marketplace. They don't have to become a board member per se, so there's a lot of ways to handle that. They could if they want to invest in the company. So I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, I would say I love asking early stage companies when you're setting up a board or you have some independent seats, saying, who is your dream independent board member? Because a lot of founders often don't realize how high they can go to get somebody out of their industry.
Like Shakira.
Yeah. And how big they can go. And so, our goal is to help them find, and then who is that person? Can we help you get in touch with them? How can we help? And so I think it's just what the goal of the board members to make the company better, right? To help you with governance, strategy, other things like that. And typically, Matthew McConaughey hasn't served on a dozen corporate boards or scaled a SaaS company, even though he may be a great spokesperson, and maybe he's on your advisory committee, or he puts some money in your round and you use him in the press release, but he's likely not going to be able to help you with, a growing company strategy, because frankly, they probably have not done that. So,
I had a business that was in the Boston market, and we used a lot of Boston celebrities, and we connected to the company in all kinds of ways. The last way I would ever do it is by making them a board member. We were still able to take all of the credit for them being part of the company. We were still able to network with them. We were still able to get what I imagine would have been all or largely all of the benefit had we made them board members, but then we didn't have to deal with them being board members. So
it's me.
Oh, here's a question here. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, disagreements?
This actually might be the toughest question.
Oh, Lord. Now I see what's coming from you. Thank you. Should a board member at this stage be expected to invest in the company? At what stage? First board?
What stage?
First boards? Early stage?
I'd say never expected to, but often that is the case. So often, especially if you're forming your first board with 3 members, even the quote-unquote independent seat, or even if you have 5 members, is typically a lot of times an early angel investor that's exited a company or multiple companies and has put some money in. So but it's definitely not a requirement from my view.
I have a pretty intense feeling about this. I think that so you're an entrepreneur, you're eating peanut butter and jelly, you're 27 years old, you've got this board member who's unpoor, you're trying to get $15,000 together for some great trip, and this board member could, when they make that investment, I think honestly, if you're going to be a board member in a very early stage company where a $25,000 check is a big deal, and you have the wherewithal to do it, I think that you can't imagine how helpful that is to the psyche of the CEO. And so obviously it's not a matter of drawing a line in the sand. You can't be a board member unless you invest, but just like, what's the point? Are you on the board to make the company better and or do you believe in the CEO? Do you believe in the company? If you don't have the funds, fine, but if you do, then why are you really there if you're not going to stroke that check? And I know that that's one-sided of me, but that's just my view.
I'd probably take exception to that, Charlie, and I would say that if you're going to serve as a board member at this early stage, first outside capital, I think it's important for you to show commitment to the company and to the CEO with a small investment, $10,000 to $25,000, and I think it's an appropriate and would be expected of a board member at this stage to be involved in the company, to also be an investor in the company, a shareholder.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I think it's almost always the case that I've seen that where they're investing.
Not unless
Number 50. We got the balloons. They're loaded.
That brings up a thought. That brings up a thought because a lot of us like serving on public company boards, and oftentimes when asked, we're quite honored to do that. At this stage of early stage first company boards, you shouldn't be expected, or you're not going to serve on a board basically unless you're an investor. And so people say, well, how do I get recruited to be on a startup company board? Well, first of all, 95 times out of 100, you got to bring your checkbook first. And you have to be very committed and understanding of the company and all the other positive things. But unless you're an investor in the company, the great majority of times, you are not going to be on a startup company board, period.
We're not here to talk about nonprofit boards, but nonprofit boards, for the most part, also expect you to put money in if you are a board member. It is that give or get. type of thing. So that translates pretty well across the board.
Yeah. Another question, what's the best way for a seed or pre-seed company to compensate a board member?
Only one way, some equity. We've had two structures. We've had a 2-year cliff, so 100% vests on the first day after the second year, and then we've done a cliff with 4 years. And our newest attorney has a different opinion, but the same concept applies, that there's some amount of time that you're going to serve, and then at some point you'll end up with a lump sum investment or vesting of those options.
What about a CPG company or something that could actually give you product?
Ooh, that sounds good.
Instead
Is
of-
it good? Is it good product?
It is good
I don't know. I could get paid in food.
Those would be the beer companies or the alcohol-related companies, perhaps, yeah,
Yeah,
which
I would
are
say,
a lot in town.
yeah, forbidden to pay cash to an early stage board member. It's always equity. I think your numbers were roughly correct, typically about 0.25% a year. You could do 0.5% to vest over 2 years, 1% to vest over 4 years. A smart independent will say, give me the 4 years, and they'll exercise those early options at the lower strike price. I have seen one example where an independent member got paid cash, and it's the latest stage company that I'm on the board of, and we think we'll get public in the next 12, 24 months, and the company is getting that stage, and this is a professional independent board member. He's literally on the board of like 7 public companies, audit chairman type person, and he has a small cash retainer, but it is minuscule compared to what that company spends on a monthly basis or anything. So that's the first example I've seen where we've paid anybody.
We're getting asked for cash by
That is
people sort of
crazy.
come. Yeah, it's totally crazy. But LinkedIn emails with a resume attached, offering to be an independent, and saying, hey, $25,000 a year, it's a bargain. It's just a strange sort of thing to say no thanks to.
Yeah, I've experienced even public companies, if you join their boards, you're asked to be a shareholder, and there's oftentimes minimum amounts of shares that are required for you to own and purchase prior to joining a board. At this early stage company level, almost 100% of the time you are asked to be a shareholder, i.e. an investor in the company, to be and receive consideration as a board member. Oh, if the current board has 2 co-founders, would a 5-member board be better? I'm assuming better than a 3-member board. Thoughts around that?
That's how when we did 2 convertible notes, and on our second convertible note, so we had raised around $2.5 million. We then started our formal 5-person board, CEO, representative of the common, which de facto were 2 co-founders, an independent, and then 2 investors. The issue that we had was we ended up starting a large board too early, and now in my A round I have a 7-member board, which is really tough. As a CEO at a startup company, I don't have the jet. I don't do the Jackson Hole thing. I never see Mitch there. And so I actually have like a real full-time job, and now I'm managing the board a lot more than I would be if I had 5 or 3. So I think 5, it makes all the sense and logical sense in the world, but then you actually have the practical responsibility of, if you want to do all the things that Rick said were good ideas, which I agree 100%, you start getting value out of boards when you start putting time into them. But individuals take time, and those calls on a Wednesday, if I've got 6 calls to make or 5 because I don't have to call my co-founder, that's a lot of time.
Which means you should never have more than 2 co-founders, and many do. I mean, that's how companies start out. Hey, 3 guys in a garage. Then you have to. So that gets messy.
Well, I would say at this early stage of investing, 3-person boards are appropriate. At the end of the day, you don't want, at this stage, you're not asking the CEO or the founder to give up control of the company. When you get to a 5-person board, there perhaps is an implication that there should be independent direction, strategic direction of the company given up by the CEO/co-founder, such that they would have 3 independent board members and 2 inside board members. And again, it's my experience and what I've come across for first monies in typically that you shouldn't be asking or thinking to ask of a CEO and/or co-founder combined to give up control of the company, even at the board level. If you have those kinds of concerns or issues, quite frankly, maybe you shouldn't be investing in the company to begin with.
Yeah, I'd say I see it both ways. Sometimes both co-founders are on the board, or they control at least like a common seat. I'm forming a board right now with a young, early-stage company, and we're setting up a board for the first time. It's the first equity money in. It's a 3-member board, and there's a female angel investor that's going to join the board with me and the founder, and but he controls that seat, so it's a common seat. So he still has control of the board and frankly, the majority of the shares.
So here's a comment and/or thought. Requiring a board member to be an investor is a barrier to entry. How does that affect the goal of diverse boards? Good question.
That's a great question, and de facto it would create a barrier to entry, and it would absolutely skew at least to wealth, and that also has a separate skew. Hadn't thought about that. That's a great point.
I guess I would only say that more and more diversity is heading into the entrepreneurial world. So I work at the University of Texas. I see diversity across that campus every day. We have entrepreneurial programs. I run a program on campus called Blackstone Launchpad. It's one of the most diverse programs I've ever been involved in. We're actually going to be doing a whole year on women and entrepreneurship. I say that just in terms of, and the University of Texas is not the only university that is doing this. So entrepreneurism and innovation education is now starting in kindergarten. So there's a lot of programs and classes and pitch competitions and other things that our kids are getting involved in that hopefully will change that pattern.
And I would say also that this gets to the core of if we're going to generally require our first outside investors to be, outside board members to be investors, then you have to also look to the investor base, and you have to, I think, also work to create more diversity at the investor level also. CTAN, for instance, has 3 times more women in our organization than we did 5 years ago, but it needs to be higher and it needs to be more. And so all kinds of ethnic diversity and gender diversity and other diversity elements need to be also provided and a part of the investor base, so that when it comes to the issues, I think, of diversity and dealing with that challenge, important challenge, that we're able to deal with it because we have better representation at the investor level also. I think I'm getting the hook. Okay, I think that's it for our panel. So thanks,
Rick.
Panelists.
Barbara, Craig, thank you so much.
Hello, hello. What a great presentation. We really appreciate it. I wanted to take just a few minutes to recognize some folks in a room today. First of all, Trent Davis with Alvarez and Marsal, Ken Bresnan with Denary, and Matt Poor with RGP. Without their support, this event would not have been possible to bring to you today, so thank you so much. I'd also like to recognize anyone who's on our board and advisory board. Without your leadership, again, this would not have been possible. You help us get better every single day. So if you're on the board or advisory board, could you raise your hand? Thank you so much. And is Barbara here still? Okay. So I'd also like to recognize a couple of folks that are here with us from National. Ben Rodabaugh, if you'd stand up, raise your hand. Ben is with our business development team at National, and if you like what you saw here today and you're interested in NACD, please talk to Ben. We've also got some brochures at the back of the room on membership. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to Julie Pitts, who is our regional director. I'd like to let you know that the presentation that we had for you today, we will send to you after the program, along with some new material that's recently came out that Ben shared with me last night on some pre-IPO intellectual capital from NACD. So we'll be sharing that with you, along with the survey. We would ask you, it's so important to have your feedback. If you wouldn't mind completing your survey, we would really appreciate it. If you don't have time to fill it out now, like I said, we will be emailing it, but please, your feedback is so important to us. And finally, I would encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. You can just search for NACD Texas Tri-Cities Chapter. We're posting information about programs, intellectual capital, thought leadership, so please give us a follow. Thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the program.